I'm LaManda Joy and welcome to Garden Book Joy. Today I'm talking with Kelly Norris about his beautiful book, New Naturalism. If you like conversations about gardening and gardening books, then you're in the right place. Do all the things below to like, subscribe, and get notifications so you know when we have our next episode and the next great author that we're talking to. Kelly, I'm so excited to have you here today to talk about your beautiful book. But before we get into it, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm a planting designer and a plantsman, a gardener, an artist that lives in Des Moines, Iowa. I really can say I've lived a life among plants. I grew up with a nursery business that I ran with my parents for 15 years, ran a botanical garden for almost a decade after that, and now find myself in public practice for public and private landscapes to create plantings on an ecological and naturalistic scale.
That's great. Well, I love your book and super kudos for the beautiful purple fly leaf. I mean, yay. I hope that we can talk about this in a little bit. I hope you advocated for that because usually they're not purple, so beautiful. But I just really want to talk about how I feel like you have made plants not just the prop and the human drama, but actors in the story. And I think that that's really what sets this book apart. I think it's so amazing that that's the perspective you've taken. Am I hitting it? I mean, it's so unusual.
Yeah, I think, and I love that analogy because to really sort of get right into it, I think one of the challenges in the way that we have thought about the making of gardens and the actual tending of gardens for so much of maybe the last 150 years in the Western world is that we think about them in two dimensions as if they were paintings inside of a frame. I mean, there's a million analogies, right, for landscapes, and they look like painting and color theory and all this sort of stuff. And those things are important, but the reality is that plants are alive and they're active components of our world, our ecosystems, and the environment. And so in many ways, the allegory really from gardening is not to visual art in two dimensions. It's really like cinema or theater or film or what have you. It's changing and evolving characters and plot lines and narratives and it's just this whole evolution in time. And I hope that in the course of the book, I certainly strive to do it in my own practice, is that we start to recalibrate people's minds a little bit to the possibilities of what plants are doing out there in place and how that might affect the way we think about gardening.
Yeah, well, I think that's really amazing. And I noticed that I love this description. Plant populations relate to one another in communities under similar conditions that form patterns given time and space. So that to me sounds very much like the permaculture concept of a guild. I feel like you really explained that in a way that every class on permaculture I've had is never explained. So can you just elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, it makes so much sense. If plants are beings like humans, they thrive in community. It's just, I love how you brought that out.
Yeah, in some ways, plants are really social creatures. I mean, they're, in the wild, plants are rarely growing in an isolated circumstance, and they really are growing in populations. Even plants that have a tendency to be, maybe we could say, antisocial, that don't occur at great frequencies or abundance in the wild, still often occur in some kind of a population structure, a few individuals, maybe. I mean, the vast majority of plants, I think, occur really somewhere in the middle of the spectrum, where their populations are maybe 7 to a dozen or more individuals growing in a particular sort of space or condition. And then these kind of add up over the scale of the landscape, depending on what you're talking about. And so I think when we try to think about that in the garden at home, what it means very practically and tangibly is that so often we've cultivated gardens of special little lollipops and crayons. I mean, we have ones and threes, and it's very in a way ecologically dysfunctional. It doesn't, plants just don't work that way. And so what we have to do as gardeners is begin to think about plants in community and in populations. So, we used to say, oh, think in 3s and 5s, right? That's the sort of standard adage. Well, in our planting practice, we think in 7s and 9s and 13s. And like we think in larger and groups and dynamics and actually really in patterns that we vary over the landscape. So bottom line, it's just more plants.
Exactly. Well, it makes perfect sense. I love also this section on plant architecture. I don't know if I've read so many books on gardening, and I've never really seen it broken out like that. Can you explain your logic? I mean, I think it's so brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of the standard rep in a lot of botany textbooks. I mean, one I think, and I'll just say before I answer your question directly, I think one of the things I'm often looking to do is find new ways of understanding by simply tapping into sources of knowledge that may be just a little far removed from where we're usually looking. The blending of horticulture and ecology, or botany and horticulture, even to some degrees, and thinking about the way plants are architected, or rather how they grow, and how they grow because of how they've evolved to the conditions in which they've grown under for a very long time. It tells us a little bit about how they're frankly adapted, because the evolution is sort of in response to something, right? And so that's adaptation that plants have to the place that they're found, the competitive dynamics of other plants around them, the resources of soil nutrition and light and water and all of these things that are available to make plants alive and thrive and reproduce and whatever in the wild, are all traits and insights that we can adapt into our gardening. But it requires us to kind of go back to fundamentals a little bit and think about plants beyond just, oh, yellow flowers in full sun and well-drained soil, right? I mean, that's very quaint, but it doesn't tell us a lot about where plants are from and how they're adapted to that place. And what we're trying to do, I think, with that is sort of take all those insights and then sort of adopt that into the garden at home.
Well, I think you've done a really great job of, as you say, taking fundamentals of maybe more of an academic pursuit to gardening that the home consumer may not necessarily, be versed in. And you've done a great job of translating that into something that everybody can understand. It's really wonderful. I love this section, the origins of wild and cultivated plants can shed insight into how and where they will grow. I think people don't realize that we have so many plants in the US and Europe because for like 150 years, like it wasn't like that before, like people went out and found things from all over the world. And now we think of them as, like normal to where we're at. And that's not necessarily true. We're talking about wild plants.
Right.
I think that's a fascinating thing. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, humans have really moved plants around at a rate and scale that doesn't have a lot of precedence in the history of the planet. And so there is that kind of footnote that has to sort of be put on plants that, say, maybe entered horticultural use from places like China, for example, relative to speaking from a US perspective, plants that might have been imported from wild places in China, like paperbark maple, for example, Acer griseum, which is so, wonderful ornamental that's been used in gardens in the Western world now for over 100 years, because it was introduced by the Arnold Arboretum back in the early 20th century at first, and then reintroduced later. But I think the point you make, though, or maybe the prong of the question is that all plants are native to somewhere, and that somewhere can tell us a lot about how those plants might perform in a landscape, and may give us cause for pause, and also may give us reason to really rethink the choices that we're making. And so, on a local perspective, you're absolutely right that the flora of the U.S. is a vast and kind of wonderful thing. It's interesting that in the pasture is always greener on the other side of the pond, right? So there's been this perspective that, China, for example, the flora of China has often been referred to in the last 100 years in ornamental horticulture as being the garden of the world, and sort of the mother of gardens, because there is such an incredible amount of plant diversity in China, more diversity there than in the US. And so we've kind of gone afield to look for things to bring back to the garden instead of maybe being aware of what's already around us, because the Europeans have come to the US and taken our plants back. So we have this sort of, roving perspective a bit, that humanity isn't quite settled unless we go find something somewhere else that's a bit removed from us. And I think the reality is I still today hear very competent horticulturists say things like, well, there's just not that many things that are interesting about native plants. I just, that's a bias and a prejudice. I just don't even know what that means. It usually means that somebody's just really unaware of the depth of flora that's here. And to be completely objective and fair, not to be snide, it's also that we still have an incredible amount of flora. In 2022, we still have an incredible amount of our native US flora that's not grown in gardens, or that's not propagated by nurseries. That should be, because it's here and we need to be rebuilding that mass of it anyway. So I think understanding where plants are from can be just profoundly insightful to even a home gardener.
Well, I love in your book how you're talking about how the prairie behind your grandma's house was like your first teacher. I mean, you obviously can see the beauty in natural landscapes that maybe people that have never been exposed to it don't really understand. I'm sure if you had $1 for every time someone said a native garden looks weedy, you could buy an island in the Bahamas, right? Like that is something that is a perception that you're clearly addressing in this book. I mean, the plant combinations and the photos in this book are so beautiful. I just they're just swoony. I did you do the photography or how?
Yeah, most of the photography is mine. We there's a little credit list in the front of folks who we used photography of, but most of it's mine. Yeah.
Well, it's a real love story. I can tell, I can see it, well, this is a good time to transition into talking about the actual creation of the book itself, because the reason I wanted to do this series is because, it's one thing having an idea about something or maybe talking about it on social media or speaking at a garden club or, wherever you might speak. It's another thing to undergo the labor of taking those thoughts out of your head and putting them out for the world. And I don't think people really understand, everybody's like, oh, I want to write a book someday. It's really, yes, exactly. It's such like giving birth to something. And I don't know anybody that feels differently about it. So tell us a little bit about your experience, like how this book journey, what was the spark and what was it like for you?
Well, you're all that is completely right at the outset. I mean, some people in the world are writers and some people aren't, just as some people are athletic and some people are, and I am not athletic. So, I'll take that one. But I some days am reluctantly a writer. Some days it's unfortunate that my mind works that way, because it can be quite distracting, because my mind is, I have this artist's heart and a scientist's head, and this kind of fusion that happens between those two pretty different perspectives on the world leads to these harebrained ideas and harebrained way of looking at the world. And then, because of just how humanity is wired, of wanting then to tell people about that or to dialogue about it. I strangely enough, I don't think of the book as a one-way street, even though it kind of is, because it's not like you have a microphone, you can read back to me something that you don't understand. But it does create, like we're doing right now, this sort of opportunity to convene around something and have a little conversation and dialogue. So anyway, the meta of all that is sometimes kind of a lonely process. I mean, it's a singular process. The idea for the book, for New Naturalism, has kind of grown from that moment you referred to in the prairie up the road from my grandmother's farm. I've always been fascinated by plants. I mean, I was a plant geek from the time I was a kid. I was just fascinated by the natural world. But I was as fascinated, LaManda, by the natural world in the prairie a quarter mile up the road, which was a whole nother, just was another sort of lens to me, as I was fascinated by the 4 o'clocks and the squash and the irises in my grandmother's garden. And it took me until I was in college to realize that those seemingly two separate conditions were not separated by anything more than something arbitrary in mine and I think a lot of humanity's mind, that somehow nature is over there because we don't see ourselves there. It's locked up in a park somewhere. And then there's everything else. And that's not how the world works. There's one planet. Like our gardens are leaky, actually, as evidenced by a whole number of incidences of plants escaping from gardens and whatever. I mean, our gardens are not separate from the world around us. They're little patches in this expansive green ecological quilt. And obviously the phrase new naturalism is not unique to me, and I take no credit for it. It's, I think, a notion that has come about, actually, to give credit where credit's due. The first author that used it in a title in a book was Keith Wiley, who owns the Garden Wildside in the UK. And actually, it was one of the first books in college, even before I read anything by Pete Aldolf or Noel Kingsbury or anything else. It was Keith's book that began to really speak to the intersection between what could be possible in gardens when we borrowed a little more inspiration from the prairie up the street, or the prairie up the county road. And that notion was planted in me then, I don't know, 15 years ago. And my interest in plants, all the roads are leading to this place of which, as it is, I think, for a lot of horticulture, we're the perspective that we bring to the garden is, I think, vastly different than maybe it's been, at least in a century. This interest, by the way, in native plants is not uniquely contemporary. It's happened before in the US. It happened in the early 20th century and kind of got lost along the way, and has sort of resuscitated and now kind of ballooned into more than just a stylistic or categorical idea. I think it's really shaping the whole way we think about gardening. But anyway, it's never like a one aha moment. I mean, it's at least for me, it's not. Maybe for other authors, that's how it comes about. But for me, it's kind of this fomenting and this kind of deliberating that leads to these books somehow.
So it's your manifesto. So what was it?
Yeah, right. I mean, I answer in a manifesto, so of course the book is just 225 pages of that, I guess. But
well, it's interesting because there are gardening books where it's, as you say, like these plants like this slide, and it's zone this, and it's zone this, and they're sort of like a catalog, right? But this is really like a philosophy, and I think you've done an excellent job with that. But how did it start? How did the idea come about? Were you approached? Did you pitch it to someone? What was the nugget?
So this is the fourth book I've written. The two prior to this were with Timber Press, who I love, and I've loved working with. Tom Fisher, my editor, for many years, just retired. I've loved the team there for a long time, and
I love Timber Press too.
Yeah, I just they really. We wouldn't have gardening books in this country in the way that we know them if it weren't for Timber Press, and so it's kind of they're kind of singular in that way. But when this book started coming up, they had other projects they were working on, and I think they were worried about maybe having too many competing titles in the same space, if you will. So we decided not to work together on this project. And my friend Jessica Walliser, who had been a timber author herself, and of course a freelancer and a speaker and horticulturist in her own right, made a decision to go be the new acquisitions editor for Cool Springs Press, which is owned by Corda, which is a big international publishing house. And so she called me up and she said, hey, I'm looking to recruit some authors, and where are you at? What are you thinking? I said, well, I've got this thing, this file folder that I need to write about. I mean, it reaches a point, as you know, that you get to a point where you feel like you have to just commit and do it. And it's a process. It's a fomenting, a deliberating, a hair pulling. It's a thing. But then you reach a threshold where you're like, okay, I gotta do it. I have to say something. And it's full of self-doubt, and it's full of all these things. Because you think, why me? Why is it's like, why is this coming from here? But I had to do it. And so that's how it began. It was our first project I've done with Cool Springs, and we kicked it off in 2019. and we were off to it.
Well, it's fabulous. It's beautiful. Extra bonus points for that purple flyleaf. What's next? You got more books in you? You know, when I was done with my book, I'm like, that's it. Although it's been creeping up, you know, in the past years, like, well, maybe that, you know, those ideas, they sort of knock, like, what about this? You know, like you sort of see a thread and it's like, ooh, you're coming to get me. You know?
Yeah, well, when I finished New Naturalism, I turned the manuscript in on June 1st, 2020. So 3 months into the pandemic, it was the worst possible time to try and finish, you know, to cross the finish line with all this stuff going on. And it was kind of deflating. I was exhausted after it. I was just kind of done. I really had to kind of hang it up, and it felt like a race that you weren't really ready for, and yet you did it anyway. And then you kind of were like, wow, I didn't train very well for that. And I don't know why I'm using that analogy, because I've never trained for a race in my life, but it seems appropriate. So I've never run a race either, so because I'm not athletic, if you remember from earlier. So I mean, I don't know it. So I kind of, like you said, I'm kind of done for a minute. But I'll tell you what, 2020 was just a trip for everybody on a lot of levels, and that. I don't know what it was. I can't pinpoint it, but actually the day I got my copy of the book, I had a real emotional kind of breakdown about it. I mean, I just was like, I couldn't. In fact, the photo I posted on Instagram, it was such a fake. I mean, I knew I had to do it just because it was part of the cycle of things, but oh my God, I was about to bawl. I mean, it was this crushing feeling of like, oh, it's not good enough. It's not going to work. I mean, and it's just, and I don't know what it was. I don't know where it came from. I think it was just a weird time and place, you know, and I just left my job 2 months before that. And it was just all this stuff kind of changing and happening at once. And yet it's gone on to be the most successful book I've ever written. It's into 5 printings now. I think there'll be 15,000 copies in distribution by the end of the year. And it's just, for a gardening book, that's kind of wild. And so it's a great reminder that artists are terrible judges of their own work, that we have no business. Just make this, you know, it's like Warhol said, just make it and let somebody else decide if it's any good or not. You know, I crossed a different professional threshold in 2020. About 6 months later, I left the Greater Des Moines Botanical Garden, where I'd been for about 8 years, and went into private practice as a planting designer and an artist. And so I kind of said, you know, maybe I'm done with writing for a little while, at least for external consumption. I write almost every day, but I don't also have to believe that anybody has to read it or care or think if it's any good. So I kind of said the same thing. And yet, you know, a year later, this thing is whispering, and a friend of mine who'd written a book in another genre and field and said, you should talk to my agent. I said, I don't want to talk to your agent. And I talked to his agent, and then suddenly, like, you know, that guy's calling me and wants to you know, talk about a project or something, and so we've not committed to it, but we're having a conversation about what that might be. I would say the place where I'm at now is thinking. I think it's on two quick points. One, I think it's really great that the tenor of the gardening conversation has shifted in this direction. I think there's a lot of people out there doing and talking about the range of these things, and I think it's great that home gardeners are thinking about that. I think the challenge, though, is that information, as we share it and learn it and exchange it in today's environment, is often laden with a lot of meta emotion and kind of noise. Frankly, it's hard to really get sort of to know what truth is, and to find logic, and to understand that outside of the realm of the things we either choose to believe or whatever. And so I say all that because I think the way that we're approaching, let's say, conservation in a big picture level, all the way down to these kinds of ways in which gardening is changing to be more aware of the world around it, needs needs more clarifying. I mean, we need to know more of the story. Science is churning out incredible new insights. And as often happens, things that come out in academic papers take a little time to get down to the public sometimes. And I want to shorten the distance between some of those things, because I think there's a lot of emerging work in the sciences that's showing us that, in fact, the world's a little more complicated than we think it is, and it's pretty complicated, it's pretty complex, and that ecology actually is kind of messy. And so to suddenly start thinking about our gardens in an ecological fashion requires, I think, us to acknowledge that messiness a little bit. So I'm wading even further into it, and we'll see where that kind of goes. But I don't know, it could be as much a book about sociology and humans and landscapes as it is about landscapes and humans. I don't know which direction it's going to come from, but it's past the whisper stage. It's now kind of knocking at the door over there, and I'm debating about how much to crack the door to let it in.
Well, I'm excited to hear that, because you do beautiful work. I think you're a real voice for something that's so important. And as you say, we live in a fast-paced world where you're scrolling, like, this is not fast knowledge, it's like, it's seasons and time and lifetimes in a way, it's observing. And
Yeah.
I think that's one of the things that people love about gardens, is they sort of bring us down to our humanity. But I know whatever you're going to do next is going to be fabulous, and I can't wait to talk to you about it. So let me thank you for being with us today, and I'm excited about collaborating with you on other projects in the near term. And have a great day.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it.